Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Lamb and today we'll be talking about memory. More specifically, we'll be talking about what are the structures and the processes involved in how memory is produced. We'll be talking about the difference between cortical, sensory, and subcortical process and what the environmental influence and development of that memory links into those. And we will also be talking about how communication is created in a neurological level. To begin, let's talk about the three different types of memory. The three different types of memory are sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. The sensory memory is the quickest form of memory. It's the initial reaction to something in the environment that triggers a natural response. These memories last about a couple of seconds, and this memory is acquired through repetition, something that you do all the time. For example, when you're in a task and somebody comes up to you and asks you a question while you're in deep with that task, your initial response could be what? What was the question again? I wasn't paying attention, but you were paying attention, and you often know the answer to your own question before you even ask it. So this is like an initial response to your environment when the environment gets involved. And this can also be a smell or something that you hear or something that you do regularly. Another example would be they've done tests on animals to when they hear a sound, they will, and if you give them a treat, they will then begin to associate that sound with being given a treat through repetition, and that sound will then become a sensory memory reaction. The second type of memory is short-term memory. This memory is much like the sensory memory in its amount of time that you keep the information, but it's the second stage of that. So if a piece of information is important enough to be held on to for a longer period of time than the sensory memory allows, it becomes a short-term memory. And the time at which you hold this memory is based on your rehearsal of that information. For example, if you use a phone number often, the first couple of times you may have a hard time remembering that phone number, but the more you need to use that phone number and the more you remember it, the longer that phone number will stay in your short-term memory. And the last form of memory and the final stage is long-term memory. This is when short-term memory's information has become so important that it may need to be permanent or last longer than a few minutes. This type of memory can last minutes, hours, days, decades, depending on how important that information is to you and how you use that information, whether you rehearse it or use your brain to retrieve that information. In other words, the more you use the information, the longer it will last. The more you retrieve the information from your memory banks, the longer that information will exist within your brain. Now, if we dive deeper into the long-term memory, it can be separated into two subcategories known as the non-declarative memory and declarative memory. Non-declarative memory is almost passive memory. This memory is controlled by your emotions and your behavior. It's not actually initiated for the brain to memorize this information. It's done automatically based on your experience with the information that you gathered at a certain point in your life. Whether you find it important or not is based on how you emotionally feel about that memory. It's also important to note that this type of information, it doesn't really have a lot of detail to which we can't really talk about it and summarize it as much as we could with the declarative memory, because the declarative memory as our second stage of the long-term memory are analytical memories. These are simply verbal memories, and this could be a good time that you you had like at a party, a really awesome party, and you remember what you did at the party. You remember who was at the party. You remember um, where the party was, what time it was. So you have a very deep understanding of that memory. So it is at this point that once again, declarative memory specifically gets split into two categories, just as long-term memory was split into declarative memory and non-declarative memory. So now we have declarative memory being separated into episodic memory and semantic memory. So semantic memory is information, but you do not know where the information came from. And that's not specifically true. The important thing is that semantic memory is knowing something without being able to really gather the information of where you learned that from. So, for example, the Earth is round, and some people would debate that today, but you generally believe that the Earth is a sphere, and most people couldn't recollect the first time they heard that there was a sphere. They just know that it is a sphere. Now, with semantic memory, this memory is specific, and you can say the information that you learned, and you know where you learned it from, when you learned it from, and who you learned it from. And this could be just uh, as easy as somebody gossiping about another person, and then you pass along that information weeks later, knowing who said it, when they said it, where they said it. And this information was important to you enough to become a part of your long-term declarative memory, and specifically the semantic memory. So now that we've discussed the different types of memory, let's talk about that structure again. So every memory begins as a sensory input memory, an initial memory, and then based on what we feel we want to from that information, it can become a short-term memory, and then with rehearsal of this memory, it can become stronger and last longer. And this means that the unrehearsed information in our short-term memory becomes lost. Now, once we use that information enough, it'll encode itself into the long-term memory and will be stored there for further use. Now, same thing. If you do not use your long-term memory, the information that you've just put in your long-term memory, it will eventually become part of your short-term memory again and go down the path, and the information will be lost. So through retrieval of that long-term information, your brain's connection with that information will strengthen, and you will be able to recollect that information easier and faster every time you do it. So now let's talk about the difference between cortical memory, sensory memory, and subcortical process. So the cortical memory process is involved with very long-term memories. This is a type of memorization that comes to us quickly and needs to come to us quickly. For example, we are able to mold our cortical memory through our environment in an instance. So, for example, when we are put into a new environment and we see a new face, our cortical memory takes that, and we are able to remember that face very easily because it is important. It doesn't take a sort of memorization tactic to memorize a face, or even movements of our arms and legs, but more than that, our cortex is involved in a lot of our critical thinking aspects of our brain structure. It's the outer portion of the brain. More scientifically, our cortex receives information from the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, where information is analyzed and stored into the memory. The first level of analysis happens in the straight cortex. The information is sent then to the exstrate cortex, where it begins to examine the more finer points of memory, like the form, color, the movement. So these memories are very important for our critical thinking abilities and our abilities to perform tasks quickly and on the spot is the quickest form of our memory. The sensory memory is like it sounds, it comes from our senses. When we go and we touch a hot pan and it hurts, the pain memory sticks with us, and we know that touching that pan again will cause the exact same reaction. And it's important because we would be touching that pan over and over and over again just to remember that it is hot. But with our sensory memory, it allows us to memorize that very quickly and reserves space in the brain for that to be quickly retrieved, so that the first time that happens, it goes, yep, that's going to be in the brain forever. So both of these types of memories have a learning process. It's something initiates the brain to analyze and remember that information. And these two things can be described as recognition or stimuli. Recognition is almost like a visual recognition, or well, that's pretty much it. And then stimuli is a reaction to a sort of physical response, whether it's something you hear, smell, touch. And that perpetual information is reached to the brain where it can quickly provide the correct reaction. So the environment links into this type of memorization, because the environment is the reason that the memorization happens. It's an adaptable type of memory. It helps us adapt to the world around us quickly, so that we're not left in the dust. We very subconsciously adjust ourselves to the environments that we are in using our recognition and sensory process. For example, let's say you are from Alaska or somewhere that is generally cold all the time, and you had vacationed in a hot climate before. And then let's say that you move from that cold climate, which is your home, to a new hotter climate. This hotter climate is going to be in your memory, and you will know how to react to that hotter climate because you have been in a hot climate like that before, even though your primary climate is the cold one. And this is an adaptation at its finest, is where humans have the ability to create the situation that they are in and make it most beneficial for them, using their recollection and their stimuli and their critical thinking to solve problems like that. Now finally, let's talk about how our brain allows us to communicate with other people on a neurological level. To begin, let's talk about three portions of the brain that provide vital roles to communication. This is the Broca's area of the brain, the auditory cortex, and the Wernicke's area. The Broca's area is in charge of our speech production, which means it works with our auditory cortex and the Wernicke's area, which is in charge of word recognition, to accumulate sentences that are going to convey the idea that is in our head to the person in front of us or to whoever you're speaking to, and allow us to take thoughts in our head, turn them into comprehensible sentences, and then the Broca's area takes that and creates the speech for us to, let it all out. Now, it's important to note that our perceptions and memories create what is known as our type of speech. As there is no correct way to pass along information, this is where we get different languages and different dialects and even different accents. People learn how to communicate information from their environment, and the brain does the best it can to accumulate the information, spit out the information in a way that will react to the crowd, so that those people will be able to understand what they are saying. So now that we've talked about how we kind of pass along information, let's talk about how we comprehend that same information. So Wernicke's area in the brain is used for word recognition, right? So that area of the brain uses our auditory and visual stimuli to collect information and store that information for further use into communicating. For example, the auditory tones that come from a word are memorized through the auditory, and then the visual is used to identify what in our environment correlates with that word. So when we have an apple in our hands and somebody says apple, the auditory part of the brain remembers that apple is the word that describes the item that is in your hand, which is an apple. And you can communicate that to the other person because they also know that this is an apple. So when that you say apple, you know that they are now thinking you have an apple.